Before the Civil War tore the United States apart, before the Trail of Tears scattered entire nations across an unfamiliar continent, and before Manifest Destiny carved a bloody trail to the Pacific, there was another war. A quieter one. A war that never had a formal declaration, no grand battlefields marked on tourist maps. It was a war of resistance, of strategy, of survival. And it was nearly won, not by a general in uniform or a president behind a desk, but by a native man with nothing but vision, charisma, and a cause. His name was Tecumseh. The early 1800s were a chaotic time for the young United States. The ink on the Constitution was still fresh. American identity was still forming. But one thing was already clear: expansion was inevitable. New states, new farmland, new settlers, and that meant new land. Land that, of course, already belonged to someone else. By the turn of the 19th century, the United States had made one thing abundantly clear to the indigenous peoples of North America: they were in the way. Settlers poured westward across the Appalachians, hungry for farmland and profit. In their wake came land speculators, militia, missionaries, and federal agents with treaties written in bad faith. Every year, another treaty. Every treaty, another betrayal. Tribes were offered goods, weapons, or small payments in exchange for their homelands, but often, those offers weren't even honored. Promises of forever turned into evictions within years. Entire villages were uprooted. Rivers that had been sacred for centuries were poisoned or fenced off. Hunting grounds disappeared. Starvation and disease crept in. To many tribal leaders, this was overwhelming. The policies were relentless. The settlers, endless. Some chose to negotiate, hoping cooperation might mean survival. Others tried to relocate peacefully. Still others fought back, but often tribe by tribe, battle by battle, disconnected, divided, doomed. But Tecumseh saw the pattern. And he saw the flaw in how his people were resisting. He understood something fundamental: the United States was united. Native nations were not. That division, he believed, was the root of their vulnerability. If the tribes could be brought together, if they could speak with one voice, raise one army, draw one boundary, they might not just survive. They might win. It was a radical idea. Not just spiritually, but politically. Tribes had their own rivalries, their own cultures, even different languages. Some had fought each other for generations. And yet, Tecumseh believed it could be done. Because the alternative was extinction. And Tecumseh knew extinction. He had seen it firsthand. He was born in 1768, near what's now Ohio, at the time, a hot zone of conflict. His father, a Shawnee warrior, was killed in a battle with Virginia militia when Tecumseh was just 6 years old. His older brother died in combat soon after. His people were forced to move, then move again. His childhood was shaped by violence and loss. But instead of becoming bitter or broken, Tecumseh became determined. He learned from every defeat. He studied white strategies. He trained as a warrior. He listened. He watched. And slowly, he began to rise, not just in the Shawnee, but across the frontier. He had no formal rank. No official title. But his voice carried. His presence commanded attention. He had a calm confidence that made people stop and listen. And what he said was fire. By the early 1800s, Tecumseh was already speaking of something that sounded impossible: a pan-tribal confederacy, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Not a tribe. A nation. One that would treat an attack on any of its people as an attack on all. He called it a wall of resistance. And he would build it. But before that wall could rise, the American government would try to knock it down, and a powerful American governor would underestimate Tecumseh's resolve. This is the story of how one man, against all odds, almost united the indigenous nations of North America into a single force that might have stopped the United States in its tracks. A man who fought not just with weapons, but with words. And for a moment, just a moment, he almost changed history. Tecumseh was born in 1768, a child of war in a world already falling apart. His birthplace, likely in present-day Ohio, lay in the heart of contested territory where American settlers, British agents, and indigenous nations collided violently and often. His name meant shooting star, and from a young age, he lived up to it, not only in battle but in how quickly he rose through the ranks of leadership. By the time most boys were learning to hunt, Tecumseh had already seen his village burned and his father killed in battle. The trauma of those early years didn't break him, it forged him. He watched his older brother fall in combat. He saw his people forced from the land of their ancestors. And as he grew, he absorbed every lesson the world had to offer, lessons in survival, in diplomacy, and in war. Unlike many warriors of his time, Tecumseh wasn't just a fighter, he was a thinker, a speaker, a visionary. He trained under the best Shawnee warriors, mastering the bow, the war club, and guerrilla tactics. But what truly set him apart wasn't his skill in battle, it was his voice. Tecumseh could speak not only his own language, but often those of neighboring tribes. He could address council fires, debate U.S. officials, and command a crowd. His words had weight. His charisma radiated calm intensity. He never shouted, but when he spoke, others fell silent. He believed that unity, not just strength, was the key to survival. Tecumseh saw that the real weapon of the United States wasn't just its guns or its armies, it was its ability to divide. One treaty here, one bribe there, one chief persuaded to sign away his land, and the march west would continue. Tecumseh made it his mission to break that pattern. He began to travel, hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands, visiting other tribes, building trust, making alliances. He didn't ask for land or riches. He didn't demand warriors for personal glory. He asked for something far greater, solidarity. To him, all native land belonged to all native peoples. No tribe had the right to sell it without the agreement of all. If the United States wanted peace, it had to respect the sovereignty of the collective. This belief would become the core of his movement, and the spark for a confrontation with a rising American figure, William Henry Harrison. Harrison was then the governor of the Indiana Territory and a man with presidential ambitions. He viewed Tecumseh not as a warrior but as a threat to expansion, a danger to progress. When Harrison negotiated the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809, seizing millions of acres in Illinois and Indiana by cutting deals with a few pliable tribal leaders, Tecumseh was enraged. He publicly denounced the treaty, calling it invalid. In a historic confrontation with Harrison, Tecumseh told him plainly, no land could be sold unless all the tribes agreed. If that principle was violated again, there would be war. Harrison scoffed. He underestimated Tecumseh's reach, his influence, and his resolve. But Tecumseh was already becoming a symbol. To many native people across the Midwest and the South, he was the first leader who truly saw the future and wanted to stop it before it crushed them all. He didn't want peace at any price. He wanted peace with dignity, with borders, with self-rule. In the eyes of the U.S. government, Tecumseh was becoming dangerous. In the eyes of his people, he was becoming indispensable. The rise of Tecumseh wasn't just about charisma or skill, it was about timing. The United States was still young, fragile, and unsure of itself. And Tecumseh had sensed an opening. He was building something bigger than resistance. He was building a wall, a confederacy, a cause, a final stand against a growing empire. And for a time, the foundation held. By the dawn of the 19th century, the United States had mastered the art of conquest without ever calling it by name. Land wasn't taken with cannons or muskets, at least, not at first. It was taken with ink. With signatures. With handshakes behind closed doors and promises that would never be kept. The government strategy was simple: divide, negotiate, and absorb. One tribe at a time. One parcel of land at a time. And when treaties didn't work, or when tribal leaders refused to play along, pressure was applied. Sometimes bribes. Sometimes threats. Sometimes both. This wasn't just policy, it was methodical expansion disguised as law. The Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809 would become one of the most infamous examples. Orchestrated by William Henry Harrison, the ambitious governor of the Indiana Territory, it involved the sale of over 3 million acres of native land. The problem? It wasn't the tribe's land to sell, or at least, not in the way the United States claimed. Harrison secured the deal by persuading only a few tribal leaders, many of whom had no actual claim or consent from their wider nations. The treaty was a legal fiction, a political sleight of hand. But on paper, it was binding. And in practice, it was devastating. Tecumseh saw it for what it was, theft. When news of the treaty reached him, his fury was immediate. But it wasn't blind rage, it was focused, strategic. He didn't just protest, he confronted. In 1810, Tecumseh marched into Vincennes, the territorial capital, with a delegation of warriors at his back. He met Harrison face to face. No interpreter. No hesitation. He told the governor plainly, the treaty was illegitimate. He argued that land belonged collectively to all tribes. No single chief, no local council, could sell it without universal agreement. If the sale stood, there would be consequences. Harrison dismissed him as defiant, but the truth was more complicated. Tecumseh wasn't just arguing over a few acres, he was challenging the entire framework of American expansion. He wasn't just protecting Shawnee land, he was drawing a line in the dirt for every indigenous nation from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. The moment was electric. Tecumseh stood there in buckskin and beads, outnumbered, outgunned, yet utterly unshaken, explaining to a future president why his empire was illegitimate. He spoke of justice, sovereignty, and the ancient right of his people to live without foreign chains. Harrison listened politely, then fortified his position. He brought in more soldiers, more cannons. He wasn't going to be swayed by words. But Tecumseh hadn't come only to persuade, he came to warn. He told Harrison that he was traveling south to speak with the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and other powerful nations. If the United States moved again against native land, the tribes would not remain divided. They would rise. They would fight. And they would fight together. To Harrison, this sounded like rebellion. To Tecumseh, it was revolution. What few American officials realized was just how seriously Tecumseh's message was being received. Across the frontier, whispers of a new alliance were growing. Warriors spoke his name with reverence. Elders recalled prophecies of unity. For the first time in living memory, tribes who had warred with one another were beginning to talk, not about peace, but about purpose. And that purpose was survival. Tecumseh's Confederacy wasn't yet an army, but it was becoming something even more dangerous, a movement. A belief that native people, if they stood together, could say no. No to removal. No to bribes. No to paper treaties that meant nothing in practice. It wasn't about hatred of whites. It wasn't about conquest. It was about drawing a boundary and holding it. But the United States was not a government that respected boundaries. And Tecumseh knew it. That's why he didn't trust negotiations. That's why he kept traveling. Kept organizing. Because he understood that the next time land was taken, it wouldn't be a debate, it would be war. And war was coming sooner than anyone thought. By the dawn of the 19th century, the United States had mastered the art of conquest without ever calling it by name. Land wasn't taken with cannons or muskets, at least, not at first. It was taken with ink. With signatures. With handshakes behind closed doors and promises that would never be kept. The government strategy was simple: divide, negotiate, and absorb. One tribe at a time. One parcel of land at a time. And when treaties didn't work, or when tribal leaders refused to play along, pressure was applied. Sometimes bribes. Sometimes threats. Sometimes both. This wasn't just policy, it was methodical expansion disguised as law. The Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809 would become one of the most infamous examples. Orchestrated by William Henry Harrison, the ambitious governor of the Indiana Territory, it involved the sale of over 3 million acres of native land. The problem? It wasn't the tribe's land to sell, or at least, not in the way the United States claimed. Harrison secured the deal by persuading only a few tribal leaders, many of whom had no actual claim or consent from their wider nations. The treaty was a legal fiction, a political sleight of hand. But on paper, it was binding. And in practice, it was devastating. Tecumseh saw it for what it was, theft. When news of the treaty reached him, his fury was immediate. But it wasn't blind rage, it was focused, strategic. He didn't just protest, he confronted. In 1810, Tecumseh marched into Vincennes, the territorial capital, with a delegation of warriors at his back. He met Harrison face to face. No interpreter. No hesitation. He told the governor plainly, the treaty was illegitimate. He argued that land belonged collectively to all tribes. No single chief, no local council, could sell it without universal agreement. If the sale stood, there would be consequences. Harrison dismissed him as defiant, but the truth was more complicated. Tecumseh wasn't just arguing over a few acres, he was challenging the entire framework of American expansion. He wasn't just protecting Shawnee land, he was drawing a line in the dirt for every indigenous nation from the Great Lakes to the Mississippi. The moment was electric. Tecumseh stood there in buckskin and beads, outnumbered, outgunned, yet utterly unshaken, explaining to a future president why his empire was illegitimate. He spoke of justice, sovereignty, and the ancient right of his people to live without foreign chains. Harrison listened politely, then fortified his position. He brought in more soldiers, more cannons. He wasn't going to be swayed by words. But Tecumseh hadn't come only to persuade, he came to warn. He told Harrison that he was traveling south to speak with the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and other powerful nations. If the United States moved again against native land, the tribes would not remain divided. They would rise. They would fight. And they would fight together. To Harrison, this sounded like rebellion. To Tecumseh, it was revolution. What few American officials realized was just how seriously Tecumseh's message was being received. Across the frontier, whispers of a new alliance were growing. Warriors spoke his name with reverence. Elders recalled prophecies of unity. For the first time in living memory, tribes who had warred with one another were beginning to talk, not about peace, but about purpose. And that purpose was survival. Tecumseh's Confederacy wasn't yet an army, but it was becoming something even more dangerous, a movement. A belief that native people, if they stood together, could say no. No to removal. No to bribes. No to paper treaties that meant nothing in practice. It wasn't about hatred of whites. It wasn't about conquest. It was about drawing a boundary and holding it. But the United States was not a government that respected boundaries. And Tecumseh knew it. That's why he didn't trust negotiations. That's why he kept traveling. Kept organizing. Because he understood that the next time land was taken, it wouldn't be a debate, it would be war. And war was coming sooner than anyone thought. While Tecumseh rode south in the fall of 1811, seeking to expand his confederacy and secure alliances with the powerful Creek, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations, he left his movement's beating heart, Prophetstown, in the hands of his brother, Tenskwatawa. The prophet, as he had come to be known, was no warrior. He was a mystic, a visionary, a man who claimed to speak directly with the Great Spirit. Where Tecumseh inspired with logic, unity, and strategy, the prophet commanded with fire, fear, and revelation. His transformation from a disgraced drunk into a spiritual leader had been dramatic, even miraculous in the eyes of many. He preached that the old ways must be restored, that native people must turn away from white goods, from alcohol, from Christianity, and from the lies of treaties. He spoke of a divine mission to reclaim their land, not through diplomacy, but through purification and righteous resistance. And many followed him, not because they understood him, but because they were desperate for meaning in a world crumbling beneath their feet. But Tenskwatawa was not his brother. He lacked Tecumseh's discipline, his clarity, his patience. While Tecumseh believed timing was everything, Tenskwatawa believed in destiny. And destiny, he claimed, had given him a vision. In that vision, he saw American soldiers marching toward Prophetstown, and he saw victory. Not just any victory, but a supernatural one. He claimed that the bullets of the white man would bounce off the chests of true believers, that warriors who followed his commands would be protected by the spirits. These promises spread quickly among the warriors stationed in Prophetstown. Some were skeptical. Others were terrified. But many, especially the young and untested, were inflamed with confidence. So when scouts reported that William Henry Harrison was approaching with over 1,000 soldiers, camped just a few miles from Prophetstown along the Tippecanoe River, the prophet made the fateful call. He would attack. In the early morning hours of November 7, 1811, native warriors launched a surprise assault on Harrison's camp. It should have worked. The Americans were tired, unfamiliar with the terrain, surrounded by hostile forest. But the warriors weren't coordinated. They lacked Tecumseh's direction. And most of all, they were not immune to bullets. The battle was chaotic, brutal, and short. Harrison's forces held their ground and counterattacked. Prophetstown's defenders were driven back. When it was over, dozens of native warriors were dead, the town was in flames, and the heart of the movement had been gutted. The prophet had promised invincibility, and delivered disaster. News of the defeat traveled fast. And with it came confusion, fear, and blame. Tecumseh, still deep in the south, returned to find not a growing alliance, but a movement in crisis. Prophetstown was gone. Many potential allies were backing away, afraid that the vision had failed. To the Americans, the Battle of Tippecanoe was a turning point. Newspapers hailed Harrison as a hero. Politicians used the victory to downplay the threat of native unity. In truth, the battle was not a decisive military victory. Harrison suffered heavy losses. His army barely avoided collapse. But optics mattered, and the prophet had handed the United States a propaganda gift. For Tecumseh, it was a bitter blow. He had spent years building trust, persuading leaders, carefully threading together tribes with generations of tension between them. And in one impulsive, uncoordinated strike, that tapestry had been torn. But he didn't give up. Tecumseh doubled down. He reassured allies. He denounced his brother's actions without abandoning him. He turned the defeat into a lesson, proof that unity was still incomplete, that spiritual belief must be paired with strategy, and that the time for scattered resistance was over. Tippecanoe didn't end the dream, but it wounded it. And the United States, sensing the weakness, would move faster, push harder, and prepare for a final reckoning. Tecumseh knew that the next phase of resistance couldn't be waged alone. So when war erupted between the United States and Britain in 1812, he made a bold and controversial choice. He would side with the empire he once fought against. Because now, his people's survival depended on something even more dangerous than prophecy: alliances. When war erupted between the United States and Great Britain in 1812, it offered Tecumseh something he had never truly had before: time, weapons, and the possibility of a powerful ally. For years, he had fought a lonely war, one of speeches, persuasion, and small-scale raids, while American settlers and armies moved west with industrial force. But now, the British needed help. They were fighting on two fronts, against Napoleon in Europe and against a young, hungry America in the West. In Tecumseh, they saw a valuable asset. In the British, he saw a potential partner. And so, the Shawnee warrior who once denounced foreign powers found himself walking into British forts, not as a subject, but as a general. It was not a decision made out of love. Tecumseh didn't trust empires. He had seen what they could do, how promises evaporated the moment convenience shifted. But Britain had guns, ships, trained officers, and most importantly, a reason to bleed America's frontier expansion. Tecumseh knew it wasn't an alliance of equals, it was a marriage of necessity. Yet, for a brief moment, it worked. In the summer of 1812, the British garrison at Fort Malden in Canada was badly outnumbered. American troops were pushing north from Detroit, preparing to invade. Tecumseh arrived with hundreds of warriors, and his mere presence transformed the war. His knowledge of the terrain, ability to move quickly through wilderness, and absolute control over his men impressed even the most skeptical British officers. But it was more than tactics. Tecumseh brought belief. When he spoke, even hardened soldiers listened. They followed his strategies. And they won. Together, Tecumseh and General Isaac Brock launched a bold attack on Fort Detroit. Tecumseh orchestrated a deception, marching his warriors in circles past the same clearing to make it appear they were more numerous than they were. The American general, William Hull, panicked. He surrendered without a fight, handing over more than 2,000 men and a critical fortress. It was one of the most embarrassing defeats in U.S. military history, and one of Tecumseh's greatest triumphs. But it would not last. The alliance that looked so strong on paper was built on conflicting goals. Tecumseh wanted to stop American expansion and secure permanent native territory. The British wanted to weaken America and protect Canada. They didn't care who owned Ohio, Indiana, or Kentucky. They didn't bleed for treaties they would never honor. And Tecumseh began to sense this. He pushed them repeatedly to commit to a formal native homeland, a place that would be recognized after the war. British officials nodded, smiled, delayed. Some made promises. None signed them. Still, Tecumseh fought. He led raids along the frontier. He harassed supply lines. He recruited more warriors from across the Great Lakes. He turned his Confederacy into a fighting force that even U.S. generals admitted was among the fiercest they had ever faced. But every month brought new cracks. British commanders grew cautious. Their attention drifted back toward Europe. Supplies ran low. Morale dipped. And in 1813, when the British began retreating from Upper Canada, Tecumseh exploded. He accused them of cowardice, of betrayal. He stood before General Henry Proctor and told him flatly, "You are unfit to command. Go put on petticoats." It was an insult in two cultures, and a warning that the next mistake might be fatal. Yet Tecumseh stayed. He refused to abandon the alliance, not because he believed in the British cause, but because he believed in his own. If this was his last chance to protect native sovereignty, then he would ride it to the bitter end. And that end was fast approaching. The Americans had regrouped. They wanted revenge for Detroit. They wanted Tecumseh dead. And they were coming for him, with fire, steel, and numbers. In the fall of 1813, Tecumseh and the remnants of his Confederacy made their final stand at the Thames River. Outnumbered, outflanked, and betrayed by the very allies he had defended, Tecumseh rode once more into battle, not for Britain, but for the land he called home. And this time, he would not return. The morning of October 5, 1813, was damp and bitter along the banks of the Thames River in Upper Canada. Fog hung low over the swampy terrain, clinging to trees like ghosts. The British army, demoralized and retreating, moved slavishly through the mud, their cannons sinking into the earth, their officers bickering in hushed voices. General Henry Proctor had promised to make a stand, but his troops were exhausted, hungry, and afraid. Behind them, like a shadow that refused to vanish, rode Tecumseh, watching, calculating, knowing exactly what was coming. The American army, now regrouped, better armed, and burning for revenge after the humiliation at Detroit, had crossed into Canada with overwhelming force. More than 3,000 men under General William Henry Harrison, the same Harrison who had clashed with Tecumseh's people years earlier at Tippecanoe, were bearing down on the British line. Proctor, seeing the odds, began to talk of retreat. But Tecumseh wouldn't have it. He had seen enough running, enough betrayal. He stood before Proctor and delivered one of his final speeches, a mixture of fury and heartbreak. He reminded the general that British promises had kept him and his people in this war, that native blood had been spilled for redcoat ambition, and that if the British ran now, they would doom every tribe that had joined Tecumseh's cause. He said, "Our lives are in the hands of the Great Spirit. We are determined to defend our lands, and if it is His will, we shall leave our bones on them." With that, he turned to his warriors, his brothers, his people, and prepared for what he must have known would be his last fight. The battlefield was chaos. The British line broke almost immediately under the American assault, their muskets firing wildly before many turned and fled. Proctor vanished from the field, galloping away with his personal guard. But Tecumseh and his warriors didn't move. They formed a line in the woods, among the trees, using the terrain as their shield. They had no artillery, no reinforcements, no retreat. Just war clubs, rifles, tomahawks, and a cause worth dying for. The Americans surged forward, expecting a rout, and instead found hell. In close quarters, Tecumseh's fighters inflicted devastating casualties, ambushing troops from behind trees, vanishing into smoke, only to strike again. It was a brutal, desperate stand. Tecumseh fought in the thickest of it, refusing to hang back, refusing to command from safety. Witnesses said he moved like a whirlwind, striking and vanishing, his war cries echoing over musket fire. But he was nearly 45 now, and the numbers were against him. At some point in the melee, he fell. No one knows the exact moment. There was no final charge, no heroic last cry immortalized in storybooks. There was only blood, smoke, and the silence that followed. When the battle ended, Tecumseh's body was never found, at least not officially. Some claimed it was mutilated by American soldiers. Others said it was taken and buried in secret by his own people, hidden so that no man could dishonor it. General Harrison claimed victory, and newspapers across the United States declared that Tecumseh, the savage emperor, was dead. But among the native nations, a different story lived. Some said he had become a spirit, returned to the earth. Some said he had escaped. Others, perhaps wiser, said it didn't matter, because what Tecumseh represented could not be buried. His death marked the end of the native confederacy he had worked so tirelessly to build. Without him, the fragile alliance crumbled. Tribes withdrew, treaties were signed under duress, and the United States moved west faster than ever. But Tecumseh's death was not a defeat. It was the final act of a life lived entirely in resistance. He had no illusions of immortality. What he wanted, what he fought for, was not just to win a war, but to prove that his people were not broken, not conquered, not alone. And for a time, he succeeded. On that battlefield, Tecumseh became more than a man. He became a symbol. And though his body may have disappeared into the earth, his legacy would remain, carved into the soil of a continent he refused to surrender. When Tecumseh fell at the Battle of the Thames, the dream fell with him. The fragile confederacy he had spent years building, on foot, through forests, across rivers, with nothing but his voice and conviction, began to unravel almost overnight. He had been its heart, its spine, its center of gravity. Without him, there was no unifying vision, no central command, no one with the trust and charisma to hold the line. The British, who had once applauded his victories, quietly stepped back from their promises. The native warriors who had bled beside redcoats watched as their supposed allies signed treaties with the very Americans they had fought to stop. Lands once promised as homelands for indigenous nations were quietly folded into new American territories. Across the Great Lakes, across the forests of the Ohio Valley and into the Mississippi Basin, the slow and brutal machinery of American expansion resumed, with more confidence than ever before. The defeat of Tecumseh's movement gave Washington exactly what it needed: space, justification, and silence. Treaties were signed at the barrel of a gun. Removal policies, once whispered, became strategy. Within a generation, Andrew Jackson would rise to power on a platform that promised to finish what Tecumseh had tried to stop, by any means necessary. The Trail of Tears, the Black Hawk War, the destruction of Seminole resistance, all would follow the vacuum Tecumseh left behind. And yet, Tecumseh's legacy refused to vanish. Among his enemies, he was remembered as a formidable foe. General William Henry Harrison, who had long sought to destroy him, would later become President of the United States, but his presidency lasted barely a month before he died, a strange historical footnote that some called poetic justice. Among his people, Tecumseh became something larger than legend. He was spoken of not as a man who failed, but as one who saw too far, too clearly. Songs were written about him. Elders passed down stories of his travels, his words, his final battle. Some tribes carried his memory like a banner, proof that once, the nations had come close to unity, close to victory, close to something unbreakable. He was remembered as a warrior who never signed a treaty, never surrendered, never backed down, even when surrounded. A leader who understood the power of land not as property, but as identity. A diplomat who could speak with chiefs and soldiers, British generals and reluctant elders, and leave all of them questioning their certainties. He was not perfect. He failed. His confederacy did not last. But history is not just the story of those who win. It is also the story of those who dared to fight anyway, knowing the odds, knowing the outcome might never favor them. Tecumseh was one of the rare figures who did not seek conquest or revenge, but balance. He didn't want to erase America. He wanted it to respect the sovereignty of the nations it sought to consume. That made him more dangerous than any raider or rebel. It made him the one man who might have forced the United States to reckon with its promises. And so, America buried him. Not just his body, but his memory, at least in the official versions. School books minimized his role. Maps erased his Confederacy. Textbooks reduced him to a paragraph beneath War of 1812. But among native peoples, his name never disappeared. It became a whisper across generations, then a song, then a symbol. Today, towns and counties bear his name. Schools, rivers, highways all echo it, some without even knowing who he was. But to those who remember, who still walk the lands he tried to defend, Tecumseh remains what he always was, a leader not just of resistance, but of vision. He showed what was possible, if only for a moment. He proved that unity was not just a dream, but a path. And in doing so, he gave a fractured people something no empire could ever fully take: hope.